Dan Blocker wasn't just a big man. He had a big heart too. As Hoss on Bonanza, he made millions laugh and cry. Off-screen, he was a loving husband and father. But in 1972, at just 43, he passed away suddenly. His death left a hole in his family and in Hollywood. For years, his son Dirk Blocker kept quiet about the pain. He built his own career in silence. But now, at 67, he's finally speaking out about his dad, about the loss, and the truth fans never knew until now. Join us as we uncover what Dirk has finally revealed and why it matters. Dan Blocker's early life. Dan Blocker's story begins in the small town of DeKalb, Texas. He was born on December 10, 1928, and he came into the world weighing a whopping 14 pounds. And did you know that he still holds the record as the biggest baby ever born in Bowie County? From the start, he stood out, and that never really changed. Dan's parents were Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker. When Dan was young, they moved to O'Donnell, Texas, about 40 miles from Lubbock. Times were hard. The Great Depression had hit the family badly. Shack, who once worked as a farmer, lost almost everything, but he didn't give up. He opened a small grocery store in town. The family lived in the back of that store. Young Dan helped out by carrying groceries to customers' cars and doing other odd jobs. His dad used to joke with friends, saying, "I'll pay you to hire Dan. He's wrecking the store with his size." Dan was big, even as a kid. But he was also gentle, kind, and quiet. That mix of strength and sweetness would become part of who he was all his life. At 13, Dan went to the Texas Military Institute. There, he played football as a linebacker. He was tall, already 6'3", and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Football opened doors for him. He got a scholarship to Sul Ross State University to play ball and study English. He later said that his size and strength helped him get to college. But what happened next would change everything. During one of the school plays, Arsenic and Old Lace, the drama club needed someone strong to move the heavy dummies used in the production. Dan was perfect for the job, but then they asked him to play a small part. Teddy Brewster, the wild and funny nephew. And just like that, something clicked. Dan loved the stage. He loved the feeling of being in front of an audience. So, he changed his major from English to theater. After college, he didn't go into pro football, even though he had the chance. Instead, he followed his heart. He acted in summer theater, repertory shows, and even had a small part on Broadway in King Lear. That was the start of his journey as an actor. But before he could go any further, duty came calling. Serving in the Army. In the early 1950s, Dan was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War. He trained at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and was later sent to Korea. He served as a sergeant in the infantry. His time there was tough. He fought in combat and got injured. For his bravery, he was awarded the Purple Heart. He also received several other medals, including the Korean Service Medal and the United Nations Service Medal. Dan's military time shaped him. He saw war up close. He knew what it meant to protect and serve. And when he came back in 1952, he was ready to start a new life. That same year, he married Dolphia Parker, whom he had met in college. Together, they started a family that would grow to include 4 children, twin daughters, Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, and 2 sons, David and Dirk. With a family to support, Dan chose a steady path. He went back to school and got a master's degree in dramatic arts, but acting didn't pay the bills right away. So, Dan took on teaching jobs. He taught English and drama at a high school in Sonora, Texas, and later worked as a 6th grade teacher and coach in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Eventually, he found himself in California, still teaching, but also getting closer to something bigger. One thing about Dan, he never forgot where he came from. Despite his size, he was known for being good-natured. Classmates and colleagues remembered him as kind, humble, and calm. That mix of strength and softness made people trust him. It also made him perfect for the next phase of his life, which was the road to Hollywood. Dan and his wife Dulphia made a big decision. They moved to Los Angeles. The dream was to give acting a real shot. His early life had shaped him for this, from helping at his dad's grocery store to leading soldiers in the army to teaching in classrooms. Dan had learned how to connect with people, and that connection showed on screen. But success didn't come overnight. Dan worked different jobs while trying to land roles. He even worked as a bouncer and a rodeo performer during his college days. Those years taught him patience and resilience, and also prepared him for what was to come: the road to Hollywood. When Dan Blocker moved his family to California, it wasn't to chase stardom. He had other plans. Dan wanted to continue studying and had enrolled at UCLA to pursue a PhD in dramatic arts. At the same time, he kept working as a school teacher. He loved kids, and they loved him back. Dan was kind, funny, and always willing to help. Even though he was a big man with a serious presence, he had a gentle heart. To support his growing family, Dan also began auditioning for small roles in television. This was in the mid-1950s, when westerns were the biggest thing on TV. And with his size and voice, he fit right in. Dan started getting bit parts in shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, Have Gun Will Travel, and Maverick. One of his more regular roles was in the series Cimarron City, where he played Tiny Buttinger. It wasn't a huge part, but it gave him steady work and brought him some attention. While teaching and acting, Dan still tried to balance school and family life. He had no big dreams of being a celebrity. He just enjoyed acting and connecting with people. What seemed like small steps would soon turn into something much bigger. He just didn't know it yet. And that turning point came when one show ended and a new opportunity appeared. Dan's big break came in 1959. That's when producer David Dortort offered him the role of Eric Hoss Cartwright on a new NBC series called Bonanza. It was a Western drama about a wealthy ranching family in Nevada. Dan's character, Hoss, was the middle son. He was big, strong, and kind-hearted. That character would define Dan's career and make him a household name. Dan once said that he based his performance as Hoss on a quote from Stephen Grelle, a Quaker missionary. "We shall pass this way on earth, but once, if there is any kindness we can show, or good act we can do, let us do it now, for we will never pass this way again." And that's exactly how he played the role. Hoss wasn't the smartest in the family, and he wasn't the best with women either. He was often the one getting tricked or laughed at, but fans loved him the most. Why? Because he had the biggest heart. Kids loved him too. In a way, Hoss was like a big kid himself, kind, innocent, and full of love. Dan appeared in Bonanza for 415 episodes from 1959 until his death in 1972. That's over a decade of being in people's homes every Sunday night. Hoss became more than a TV character. He felt like family. Behind the scenes, Dan was just as warm as the man he played. He became close friends with co-stars Michael Landon and Lorne Greene. They spent long days filming together, starting at 7 a.m. and finishing around 9 p.m. 5 days a week. They even socialized off-set. Dan was best man at Michael Landon's wedding to Lynn No. But even with the busy filming schedule, Dan still found time to appear in other projects, and many of those came with big Hollywood names, working with legends and Hollywood offers. While Bonanza kept him busy, Dan still took on other acting jobs. In 1963, he starred with Frank Sinatra in Come Blow Your Horn, a light comedy. 5 years later, in 1968, he acted with Sinatra again in Lady in Cement, where he played a tough and intimidating character, very different from Sweet Hoss. Dan also got noticed by major directors. One of them was Stanley Kubrick, who wanted to cast him in Dr. Strangelove. The plan was for Dan to play Major T.J. King Kong, the soldier who rides an atomic bomb like a cowboy in one of the film's most iconic scenes. But Dan's agent didn't like the script and turned it down. The role eventually went to Slim Pickens. Around that time, Dan starred in Something for a Lonely Man, a TV film where he played a blacksmith named John Killebrew who leads settlers to California. The movie also featured actors like Susan Clark and Don Stroud. In 1970, Dan appeared in The Cockeyed Cowboys of Calico County, where he played a shy man looking for love. Nanette Fabray played his romantic interest, and the cast also included stars like Mickey Rooney and Jack Elam. He even made a guest appearance on The Flip Wilson Show, showing off his comedy skills. Director Robert Altman, who had worked with Dan on Bonanza, became close friends with him. Altman later wanted to cast Dan in The Long Goodbye as the character Roger Wade. Sadly, Dan passed away before filming began. The role went to Sterling Hayden, and the film was dedicated to Dan's memory. While acting, Dan also became part owner of the Bonanza Steakhouse restaurant chain. He made commercials and public appearances as Hoss to help promote the brand. It was a successful business venture, and it showed that Dan's star power went far beyond television. But no matter how big he got, Dan never forgot where he came from. Dan had long moved his parents from Texas to California so they could be closer to him. But the little town of O'Donnell, Texas, never stopped thinking of him as one of their own. When Bonanza made Dan a star, his old friends and neighbors couldn't believe the quiet boy they remembered was now riding across their TV screens on horseback. They used to joke about how young Dan always had his nose in a book. Now, he was part of one of the most loved shows on television. And even as he played a cowboy, he brought the same calm, thoughtful nature he had as a kid. Dan's character, Hoss, was all about fairness, kindness, and standing up for what was right. And that wasn't just acting, it was who Dan was. He believed in justice. He cared about people. He was never interested in being flashy or famous. He just wanted to do good work and be good to others. In many ways, Dan Blocker was like a gentle giant, strong but soft, famous but humble. His time on Bonanza made him a legend, but it was his heart, both on and off the screen, that made him unforgettable. The man behind Hoss Cartwright. When Dan Blocker moved to Los Angeles in 1958, his plan was to study further at UCLA, but life had other ideas. His time on stage during college had already lit a spark in him. Acting wasn't just something he tried once, it was something he felt connected to. Years earlier, after earning his degree from Sul Ross State College, he had performed in a summer stock play in Boston. That early experience stayed with him. Dan was a family man. He married his college sweetheart, Dolphia Lee Parker, on August 25, 1952. They met while studying at Sul Ross. Together, they had 4 children, twin daughters Dana and Deborah, and 2 sons, David and Dirk. All of them grew up in a home full of love, and later, Hollywood talent. David became a producer and won an Emmy in 1998 for producing Don King, Only in America. Dirk, on the other hand, followed in his father's footsteps and became an actor. Dan was also a man of faith. He was a Free Methodist. Politically, he leaned left. He supported Democratic candidates like Pat Brown in 1966 and later Eugene McCarthy in 1968. Eventually, he backed Hubert Humphrey in the presidential race against Richard Nixon. He was not just an actor. He was a man with strong values and beliefs. The family lived in California, where they had 2 homes, one in Inglewood and another, much larger Tudor-style mansion in Hancock Park. Despite fame and fortune, Dan kept things grounded. Actor Mitch Vogel, who played Jamie Cartwright on Bonanza, once said Dan was the kind of guy you could go and have a beer with. That says a lot about the kind of man he really was. But his true love was his family, and the way he raised his children proves it. A loving father at home. Dan Blocker may have been famous on TV, but at home, he was just Dad. He made time for his kids, no matter how busy he was. He once told the Tampa Bay Times, "We've got a pretty good crew." That one line says a lot. He was proud of his children and loved spending time with them. In interviews, Dan would explain that while he was the easygoing parent, his wife Dolphia was the disciplinarian. He believed in structure for his children. If one of our children isn't in bed and asleep by 8 o'clock at night, his name goes on a list for 1 week, he said. That means the child is not a member in good standing in the 8 o'clock club. The kids wanted to stay in the club, so bedtime wasn't a problem. It was Dan's simple but clever way of keeping the household running smoothly. Dan also allowed his children to watch Bonanza, but he made sure they knew it was all make-believe. He told them, "It's just a job." But to them, seeing their father as Hoss Cartwright felt very real. One night, while watching the show, one of his daughters saw a scene where Hoss got grazed by a bullet. She panicked, thinking her dad had really been hurt. She ran to him, jumped into his lap and asked, "Do you feel all right, Daddy? Can I get you an aspirin?" That moment showed just how deeply his kids cared for him, not just as a father, but as their hero. And while Dan could separate his work from home, that moment reminded him that to his kids, he was more than just a man on TV. He was their safe place, their Hoss in real life. But everything changed in 1972. On May 13, 1972, Dan went to a Los Angeles hospital for what was supposed to be a routine gallbladder surgery. No one expected anything to go wrong. He was 43, healthy, and at the top of his career. Bonanza was still going strong, and fans looked forward to another season. But something no one could predict happened. Dan developed a blood clot in his lung, also known as a pulmonary embolism. And just like that, he was gone. The news shocked everyone: his wife, his 4 children, his co-stars, and the millions who had welcomed him into their homes each week. Dan Blocker was no more. The cast of Bonanza was deeply affected. Michael Landon, one of Dan's closest friends, later said that whenever he needed to cry for a scene, he would think of Dan's death. That was how close they were. The entire crew felt like a family, and losing Dan felt like losing a brother. The writers of Bonanza did something unusual at the time. They acknowledged the death of Dan's character, Hoss Cartwright, in the storyline. This was rare in TV history. They didn't go into details, but the show made it clear. Hoss was gone. Years later, in a sequel series called Bonanza, The Next Generation, a character mentioned that Hoss had drowned while trying to save someone else's life. It was a fitting tribute to the kind of man Dan was, always putting others first. Bonanza continued for one more season, but things weren't the same. The energy had changed. That final season ended on January 16, 1973, and it was the least popular of all. Fans missed Hoss. They missed Dan. The show had lost its heart. Even in death, Dan stayed close to his roots. Resting in the land he loved. Dan Blocker's final resting place is in his hometown of DeKalb, Texas. He was buried in Woodman Cemetery in a family plot. He was buried in Woodman Cemetery in a family plot. His grave is simple, just a plain stone with the name B. Dan D. Blocker engraved on it. No fancy statue, no loud words, just peace and quiet, exactly the way he might have wanted it. Beside him lie 3 of his family members: his father, his mother, and his sister, the ones who raised him, supported him, and watched him become the man he did. The small town of DeKalb may have been far from Hollywood, but it was never far from Dan's heart. Even after he moved his parents to California to be near him, the town of O'Donnell never forgot their gentle giant. Locals still remembered the boy with his nose in a book, the young man who helped in his father's grocery store, and the student who always stood out for his size and his kindness. They watched with pride as he rode across their TV screens as Hoss Cartwright. Dan never forgot them either. He may have lived in big houses and worked with Hollywood stars, but deep down, he was still that Texas boy with a soft heart and a strong sense of family. His legacy lives on, not just through his work, but through the stories his children now tell and the love fans still hold for him today. And no one carries that legacy more closely than his son, Dirk Blocker. Dirk Blocker was born on July 31, 1957, in Los Angeles, California. He was the youngest son of the beloved actor Dan Blocker, who played Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza. Growing up, Dirk had a special bond with his father. He would often visit him on set, watching him bring Hoss to life. Those moments meant everything to him. Dan wasn't just a television star. To Dirk, he was his hero. But being the child of a famous person came with its own pressure. Dirk once said, "Growing up with a famous father stripped me of any desire for fame. My pop could hardly go anywhere without being mobbed by fans." Still, he admired his father's work. That's why, even though fame didn't appeal to him, acting did. Dirk made his first appearance on screen in 1964. He was just a little boy when he appeared with his dad in a car commercial. It was a short moment, but it planted a seed. Then, everything changed in 1972 when Dan died of a pulmonary embolism. Dirk was just 14 at the time. He later shared, "It was overwhelming. I did a pretty good job of denying the impact his death had on me. The reality of his passing was just too much." And yet, even while hurting inside, Dirk kept moving forward, choosing his own path in Hollywood. Just 2 years after his father's passing, Dirk made his TV debut in 1974. He acted in an episode of Marcus Welby, MD. He was only 16. A year later, after finishing high school at Santa Monica High, Dirk's career picked up speed. One of his first big roles was playing Abel McKay, an illiterate mountain boy, on Little House on the Prairie. The role suited him well. Just like his father, Dirk had a way of making characters feel real and warm. Over the years, he appeared in many popular shows. These included MASH, Walker, Texas Ranger, ER, The X-Files, Doogie Howser, MD, Matlock, Quantum Leap, Chips, and Murder, She Wrote. But his first regular role came in 1976. Dirk played First Lieutenant Jerry Bragg on Ba Ba Black Sheep, a military drama that aired until 1978. He was only 19 at the time, and he held his own on screen. Though Dirk worked steadily, he stayed away from the spotlight. He didn't want fame the way others did. He preferred supporting roles and character parts, just enough to stay in the game but not be chased by cameras. That's what made him happy. Later, Dirk would appear in 2 Bonanza TV movies, Bonanza, The Return, and Bonanza, Under Attack. In these films, he didn't play Hoss's son. Instead, he played a reporter named Walter Fenster. It was a subtle nod to his father's legacy, but it also showed that Dirk wanted to make his own name. Years later, from 2013 to 2021, Dirk starred as Detective Hitchcock in the hit comedy series Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It was another reminder that he had carved out a career in his own style, steady, respectful, and always dependable. But even as his career grew, Dirk was still holding on to the memory of his father. Dirk's relationship with his father. Dan Blocker's death affected Dirk deeply. He didn't talk about it much in the early years. Instead, he poured himself into acting. It became his escape. Acting gave him a way to step outside himself and live in someone else's world, even if just for a little while. But behind the scenes, Dirk was struggling. He once admitted, "My dad was my closest ally in the world. I loved him dearly." He went on to describe his father as a complex man, someone who cared about justice, who was generous, and who lived large in many ways and loved to laugh. Dirk tried to stay professional in public, but privately, he lived a fast and wild life. It was his way of running from the pain. And yet, even through all the tough times, he kept working. That work helped him heal. Over the years, Dirk also looked for ways to grow beyond acting. He went back to school to earn his Bachelor of Arts degree so he could teach K-12. He even wrote a book. In 2017, Dirk published Master and the Little Monk, a story about a lonely boy who finds an unusual friend and mentor. The story was close to his heart, maybe even a reflection of his own journey. Dirk's story reminds us that even when you lose someone you love, their spirit never truly leaves. And for Dirk, Dan's memory lived on, in his work, in his family, and in the town that never forgot him. Even though Dan Blocker became a star in Hollywood, his roots were still in Texas, and the town of O'Donnell never stopped honoring him. After Dan's death, the town preserved his memory in touching ways. The family's old grocery store, where Dan once stocked shelves and carried bags, still stands, though it's now boarded up. The name Blocker is still written boldly above the entrance. And right at the front, there's a giant yellow cowboy hat painted where the door used to be. Inside the O'Donnell Heritage Museum, there's a whole room filled with Bonanza memorabilia and items from Dan's life. Across the street, a small park holds a sculpture, a life-size bronze bust of Dan Blocker. The statue was created by artist Glenna Goodacre and installed in 1973. A plaque at the site reads, "Thanks to film, Hoss Cartwright will live, but all too seldom does the world get to keep a Dan Blocker." Dan may have played a role on screen, but it was his real-life character that touched people most. He was a husband, a father, a friend. He didn't live fancy. Even in death, he remained humble. Dan Blocker is buried in a quiet cemetery in DeKalb, Texas. He once said, "Fame frightens me. It truly does. Perhaps because I wasn't expecting it. I feel like I have a tiger by the tail." And in another interview, he added, "I'm in this business for the money. I need money, like anyone else, because I want to give to my wife and kids a good home and a good life." Dan never chased fame. He chased a better life for the people he loved. That's what made him special. That's what made Dirk look up to him. And that's what fans remember today. Not just Hoss Cartwright, but the man who brought him to life. What's your favorite memory or moment of Dan Blocker as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza? And do you think Dirk Blocker's quiet tribute to his father through his own career kept Dan's legacy alive in a special way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more incredible stories from Hollywood's fascinating history. See you next time.